Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a story that's been hiding in the shadows of Japanese history for far too long. A story about warriors who were every bit as deadly, strategic, and fearless as their male counterparts, but whose names were quietly written out of the history books. We're talking about the Onna-bugeisha, the female samurai warriors of feudal Japan. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten history, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps me keep making these videos. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's settle in for tonight's journey. When most people think of samurai, they picture stern men in elaborate armor, katanas gleaming in the sun, horses thundering across battlefields. That image isn't wrong. Exactly, but it's incomplete. For centuries, alongside those male warriors, there were women who trained in the same arts, fought in the same battles, and defended the same territories. They were called Onna-bugeisha, which translates to female martial artist, and they were members of the bushi, the warrior class of feudal Japan. These weren't women playing at being warriors or picking up a weapon once in desperation. They were trained from childhood in combat, strategy, and the philosophy of bushido, the way of the warrior. They led troops into battle. They defended castles against armies. They commanded respect through skill and courage. And then, as Japan transformed and modernized, their stories were systematically erased, their accomplishments minimized, their very existence questioned. But archaeological evidence keeps proving they were there. Battle sites across Japan have been excavated, and researchers have found something remarkable. At the site of the Battle of Senbon Matsubaru in 1580, studies of 105 bodies recovered suggested that 35 were female based on skeletal analysis. That's over 30%. And this wasn't even at a castle, where you might expect women to be defending their homes. This was an open battlefield. According to Japanese archaeologist Suzuki Hiroatsu, the absence of fortifications at the site led him to conclude that these women came there specifically to fight and to die. Other battle sites throughout Japan have shown similar patterns, suggesting that female participation in warfare may have been more common than traditional histories acknowledged. Now, there's been some controversy about exactly how these determinations were made. You might have seen claims online about DNA testing proving these warriors were female. The reality is more nuanced. The original studies from 1988 and 1989 by Suzuki Hiroatsu used osteological methods, examining the size and shape of bones, particularly temporal bones of the skull, to determine biological sex. This is a legitimate archaeological technique, though it's less definitive than DNA analysis would be. The claim about DNA testing appears to have originated with historian Stephen Turnbull's 2010 book. But he didn't cite a source for it, and researchers haven't been able to find any actual DNA studies from that period. This doesn't mean the findings are wrong. Experienced osteologists can determine biological sex from skeletal remains with reasonable accuracy. But it's important to be precise about what was actually done versus what's been claimed in popular retellings. What matters is that these women existed. The archaeological evidence is clear. The historical records, when you dig into them, mention female warriors repeatedly. And the question becomes, How did this happen? How did women in feudal Japan, a society we often think of as rigidly patriarchal, become warriors? And more importantly, why were their stories nearly lost to history? Let's start at the very beginning, in the mists of ancient Japan, with a woman who may or may not have existed, but whose legend shaped everything that came after. The ancient foundations, Empress Jingu, and the birth of a legend. The story of Japanese female warriors begins, as many legendary tales do, somewhere in that hazy territory between myth and history. Traditional chronicles place a woman named Empress Jingu around the year 200 AD, though modern scholars debate whether she existed at all. Her husband, Emperor Chu-ai, had died, and by all conventional expectations of the time, she should have stepped aside, mourned appropriately, and let the men handle the business of ruling and warfare. Instead, according to the legends, she did something extraordinary. Despite being pregnant with the future Emperor Oh-Jin, Jingu personally organized and led a military expedition to invade the Korean peninsula. The chronicles describe her binding her pregnant belly, donning men's clothing and armor, and riding at the head of her army. Legend claims she conquered the region without shedding a single drop of blood, though historians understandably doubt that part. The stories then say she returned to Japan and ruled as regent for the next 70 years, living to the age of 100, numbers that strain credibility even by ancient standards. Now, did Empress Jingu actually exist? Scholars debate this vigorously. Some consider her entirely mythological, a composite of several historical figures, or a personification of Japan's early military expansion. Others believe there's a kernel of truth beneath the legendary embellishments. The dates don't quite add up, the details strain credibility, and primary sources are frustratingly sparse. But here's what matters. The story of Empress Jingu became foundational to Japanese culture. She appeared on Japanese banknotes in 1881, becoming the first woman to receive that honor. Her image represented something powerful, the idea that women could be more than passive observers of history, that they could be warriors, leaders, conquerors. Whether she truly lived or not, her legend provided a template, a permission structure for the Onna-bugeisha who would follow, and they did follow, in increasing numbers as Japan entered its medieval period. By the late Heian period, around 1100 AD, women of the warrior class were receiving martial training as a matter of course. This wasn't about equality in the modern sense. It was brutally practical. In a feudal society constantly at war, where men might be called away to battle at any moment, someone had to be able to defend the home, the family, the estate. That someone was often the women. These early Onna-bugeisha learned to fight with a weapon specifically suited to their needs. A polearm with a curved blade called a naginata. Think of it as somewhere between a spear and a sword, mounted on a shaft that could be anywhere from 4 to 8 feet long. The weapon had several advantages. Its length allowed a fighter to keep enemies at distance, compensating for differences in reach or physical strength. The curved blade could slice through armor with devastating effect. And perhaps most importantly, its use emphasized technique, strategy, and precision over raw power. The naginata became so associated with female warriors that it's still sometimes called a women's weapon today, though originally men used it extensively too. particularly against cavalry. For the Onna-bugeisha, it was the perfect tool. Combined with training in archery, horseback riding, and hand-to-hand combat, these women became formidable defenders. But some would become even more than that. Some would become legends. The Genpei War and the legend of Tomoe Gozen. The late 12th century in Japan was a time of spectacular violence. Two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, were locked in a catastrophic power struggle that would determine who controlled the imperial court and, effectively, all of Japan. The conflict that erupted between them, known as the Genpei War, lasted from 1180 to 1185 and left thousands dead. It also produced some of the most famous warrior tales in Japanese history, and right in the middle of all that chaos, there was Tomoe Gozen. The primary source for Tomoe's story is the Heike Monogatari, the tale of the Heike, an epic chronicle of the Genpei War compiled in the early 13th century. Think of it as Japan's equivalent to the Iliad, a mixture of historical events and literary embellishment, chanted by blind monks to the accompaniment of the biwa, a Japanese lute. The tale describes Tomoe in terms that still resonate today, 8 centuries later. The text says that Tomoe had long black hair and a fair complexion, and her face was very lovely. Moreover, she was a fearless rider whom neither the fiercest horse nor the roughest ground could dismay. And so dexterously did she handle sword and bow that she was a match for 1,000 warriors, and fit to meet either god or devil. That's quite an introduction. But the chronicle goes further, describing her actual deeds in battle. Tomoe served Minamoto no Yoshinaka, also known as Kiso Yoshinaka, a cousin of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would eventually become shogun. The exact nature of their relationship is unclear from the sources. She might have been his lover, his wife, his foster sister, or simply a trusted warrior in his service. What is clear is that Yoshinaka trusted her completely and sent her out as his first captain, his primary commander. In 1184, Yoshinaka found himself in an impossible situation. His cousin Yoritomo, suspicious of Yoshinaka's ambitions, had sent armies to eliminate him. At the Battle of Aizu, Yoshinaka's forces were hopelessly outnumbered. According to the chronicle, he began the battle with 300 warriors and was soon down to just 7. Tomoe was among those 7. The tale describes her in those final moments with almost painful clarity. She stayed at Yoshinaka's side even when all seemed lost, even when retreat or surrender would have been the sensible choice. According to the chronicles, she encountered and defeated a renowned enemy warrior from the Musashi clan in single combat. Different versions of the story give different names for this opponent, but all agree on the outcome. She grappled him from his horse onto her own saddle, beheaded him, and kept his head as a trophy. What happened next depends on which version of the story you read. Some say Yoshinaka ordered her to flee, telling her that he wished to die without a woman beside him, as it might bring him shame. Others say she left of her own accord after one final glorious fight. The Genpei Jo Su-iki, a more detailed later text, claims she was captured by a warrior named Wada Yoshimori, who was so impressed by her that he married her or took her as a concubine. Another tradition holds that she became a nun and lived to the age of 91. And here's where things get complicated. Does Tomoe Gozen's story represent historical fact? The honest answer is we don't know. She doesn't appear in contemporary battle records or official documents. Only in literary sources, compiled decades after the events they describe. Some historians believe she's entirely fictional, a romantic invention. Others think she's based on a real warrior whose deeds were embellished over time. But recent scholarship has been tilting toward the view that Tomoe likely existed in some form. For one thing, her name appears consistently across multiple versions of the chronicles, with specific details that match known historical events. For another, we now know from archaeological evidence that female warriors were common in this period. There's even a naginata preserved at Oyamazumi Shrine that's said to have belonged to her. Perhaps most tellingly, the chroniclers who wrote about her seem almost uncomfortable with her existence. They emphasize her beauty alongside her martial prowess, as if trying to reconcile her warrior nature with feminine ideals. They have her lord order her to leave the battlefield, preserving male honor even as they acknowledge her incredible skill. These details suggest the chroniclers were trying to fit a real, inconvenient woman warrior into acceptable narrative frameworks, rather than simply inventing a fantasy. What's especially interesting about Tomoe, though, is that she was what Japanese sources call an Onna-bugeisha rather than just Onna-bugeisha. That distinction matters. Most female warriors were primarily defensive fighters, trained to protect their homes and families when men were away. Tomoe fought offensively. She led troops in attack, participated in offensive battles, rode at the front of cavalry charges. According to some accounts, Yoshinaka valued her so highly that he considered her capabilities equal to any general in Japan, an extraordinary recognition for any warrior, regardless of gender. This made her exceptional even among exceptional women, and her legend would inspire Onna-bugeisha for centuries to come. But she wasn't alone in her fame. Just 17 years later, another female warrior would prove herself on a different battlefield, in a different war, Hangaku Gozen, the archer who defied an army. If Tomoe Gozen was the legendary swordswoman who captured popular imagination, Hangaku Gozen was her contemporary equivalent in raw, documented historical record. Born around 1170 in Echigo province, in what's now Niigata Prefecture, Hangaku came from the Jei clan, a family of provincial warriors aligned with the defeated Taira side after the Genpei War. The Taira's loss left the Jei clan diminished, stripped of power, forced into relative obscurity. But they hadn't forgotten what they'd lost. In 1201, Hangaku's uncle, Jo Nagamochi, decided enough was enough. On New Year's Day, he launched what became known as the Kennin Rebellion against the Kamakura shogunate, hoping to overthrow Minamoto rule. The initial assault on the capital failed miserably. Nagamochi was captured and beheaded, but back in Echigo, the rest of the clan wasn't ready to surrender. This is where Hangaku enters the story. Together with her nephew, Jo Sukemori, she took command of what remained of the clan's forces, roughly 3,000 men, and fortified themselves at Torisakayama Castle, also called Tosaka Castle in some records. The shogunate responded by sending an army of 10,000 to crush them. Those are devastating odds, but Hangaku had a plan. The Azuma Kagami, a chronicle written by people contemporary to these events, describes Hangaku's abilities in terms that still seem remarkable today. It notes that woman, though she was, she could shoot with extraordinary accuracy. The phrase used is hyapatsu hyakuchu, meaning 100 shots, 100 hits. The chronicle specifically states that her archery skills surpassed even those of her father and brothers, and that this seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. During the siege, Hangaku positioned herself in the castle tower, dressed in male clothing and armor, her hair tied back in the style of a young man. From this elevated position, she directed the defense and rained arrows down on the besieging forces. According to the accounts, very few of those she aimed at survived. Her volleys were so effective that the shogunate forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, struggled to make progress. The siege lasted roughly 3 months. 3 months of Hangaku and her forces holding out against an enemy more than 3 times their size. But eventually, the overwhelming numbers took their toll. An arrow struck Hangaku. Sources differ on whether it hit her thigh or both legs, but all agree the wound was severe enough to incapacitate her. Only after she fell did the castle's defenders begin to falter. She was captured, seriously wounded, but still alive. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Hangaku was brought before Shogun Minamoto no Yori-ie as a prisoner of war. By all rights, she should have been executed or ordered to commit ritual suicide. She was a rebel, a leader of an uprising against his rule. But according to the Azuma Kagami, when Yori-ie saw her, he was struck by her bearing. The chronicle describes her as fearless as a man and beautiful as a flower, noting that she stood before him with dignity, despite her wounds and her certain fate. One of Yori-ie's retainers, a warrior named Asari Yoshito, was so impressed by her courage that he asked permission to marry her. His reasoning, as recorded in the chronicle, was pragmatic. Such a woman would surely bear strong sons who would serve the shogunate loyally. Yori-ie initially mocked the request, suggesting that Hangaku was so unwomanly she probably had no interest in men. But Asari persisted, and eventually Yori-ie relented. So instead of death, Hangaku was married off to a shogunate warrior. She bore him a son, though little is recorded about the rest of her life. Some sources suggest she died not long after, possibly from complications of her wounds. Others claim she lived many more years. Either way, her story demonstrates something crucial about the Onna-bugeisha. These were not mythical figures from ancient legend. Hangaku Gozen's exploits are documented in official government chronicles, written by court bureaucrats who had no reason to embellish or romanticize female warriors. She existed, she fought, she commanded thousands of men in a desperate defense against overwhelming odds. And she did it so effectively that even her enemies were forced to acknowledge her skill. The naginata, weapon of the Onna-bugeisha. Let's talk about the weapon that became synonymous with female warriors in Japan. The naginata is one of those pieces of martial equipment that's perfectly designed for its purpose. The kind of thing that makes you wonder why it took humans so long to figure it out. At its most basic, a naginata is a pole weapon with a curved blade at one end. The shaft, typically made from sturdy wood like oak, ranges from about 4 to 8 feet in length. It's oval in cross-section, which gives you a better grip and more control than a simple round pole. The blade itself, forged in the same manner as a traditional katana, is usually between 1 and 2 feet long, curved and wickedly sharp on one edge. The weapon evolved sometime in the late 1st millennium AD, possibly developing from an earlier weapon called the hokoyari, or perhaps simply as a practical innovation. Put a sword on a long stick, you get better reach. By the Heian period, around the 10th century, it had become standard equipment for many warriors, particularly effective against cavalry. A fighter with a naginata could keep mounted warriors at bay, slash at the horse's legs, or pull riders from their saddles. But here's where things get interesting for our story. During the Genpei War period and afterward, the naginata became increasingly associated with female warriors. Why? Because it was nearly perfect for the role these women needed to fill. First, consider the physics. A naginata doesn't require the same kind of raw upper body strength as sword fighting in close quarters. Yes, you need to be strong. Don't misunderstand. Swinging an 8-foot pole weapon with a heavy blade on the end is serious work, but the weapon's length and leverage do much of the work for you. A strike gains momentum as the blade travels in its arc. By the time it connects, it's carrying considerable force regardless of the wielder's physical strength. Second, the range advantage is enormous. If you're defending a position, whether it's a castle gate, a doorway, or a narrow corridor, a naginata allows you to engage attackers before they can close distance. They have swords? Great. Those swords are useless until they get within arm's reach, and your blade can reach them 3 or 4 feet before that happens. Even multiple opponents can be kept at bay by a skilled naginata wielder, because approaching through that arc of steel is a very dangerous proposition. Third, the techniques emphasized precision, timing, and defensive positioning over aggression. This suited the primary role of most Onna-bugeisha, defending fixed positions, usually their homes or castles. You didn't need to be able to chase down fleeing enemies or break through shield walls. You needed to hold a position, and the naginata was built for exactly that. Training with the naginata was serious business. Young women of the samurai class began learning as children, just as boys did. They learned the basic stances, the kamae, with emphasis on body balance and how to hold the weapon properly. The grip is crucial, one hand near the blade for control, the other further down the shaft for power and leverage. They practiced forms, repeated sequences of movements that trained muscle memory and proper technique. But they also learned the philosophy behind the weapon. This wasn't just about physical combat. The way of the warrior, bushido, emphasized mental discipline, honor, loyalty, and courage. For Onna-bugeisha, these principles were filtered through a particular lens. Their primary duty was to protect their families and their lord's household. Failing in this duty meant dishonor not just to themselves, but to their entire family line. Some of the training could be brutal. Historical accounts describe women practicing in full armor for hours, drilling the same movements until they could execute them perfectly while exhausted. They learned to fight from different positions, standing, kneeling, even lying down. They studied tactics for defending castles, including how to counter cavalry charges, how to fight multiple opponents, and how to make best use of defensive terrain. And here's something that often surprises people. Many of these women also became skilled archers. The yumi, the Japanese longbow, was another ranged weapon that didn't rely solely on physical strength. Technique and practice mattered more. A trained Onna-bugeisha with a bow could defend castle towers effectively, raining arrows on besiegers from elevated positions. Hangaku Gozen's legendary accuracy with a bow wasn't unique. Many female warriors were deadly archers. By the Edo period, when Japan entered a long era of relative peace, the naginata's role evolved. It became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of status for women of samurai families. A naginata might be part of a bride's dowry when she married into another samurai household, representing her training and her readiness to defend her new home. Schools focusing on naginata techniques proliferated, and while men still learned the weapon, it became increasingly associated with female practitioners. This association has persisted. Even today in Japan, naginata is practiced primarily by women in both classical Koryu schools and modern atarashi naginata competition sport. The weapon that once defended castles and cut down enemy warriors has become a means of preserving traditional martial culture and providing physical and mental discipline. The legendary Onna-bugeisha like Tomoe Gozen are revered in these schools, their names invoked as exemplars of what a naginata practitioner should aspire to become. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in feudal Japan, in an era when these weapons weren't ceremonial at all. They were tools of survival, wielded by women who knew that failure meant not just their own death, but the destruction of everyone they loved. The Sengoku period, when all Japan went to war. If the earlier periods saw women warriors as defensive specialists protecting their homes, the Sengoku period turned everyone, regardless of gender, into combatants. From 1467 to around 1615, Japan descended into a chaos of near-constant warfare that historians call the Warring States period. The central government collapsed. Regional lords, called daimyo, built up private armies and fought each other for territory, resources, and survival. The period began with the Nin War, a succession dispute that started in 1467 and managed to destroy most of Kyoto, the imperial capital, before it petered out in 1477. But the damage was done. The authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, already weak, evaporated almost completely. What followed was more than a century of near-continuous civil war. For our story about Onna-bugeisha, this period matters because warfare became total in a way it hadn't been before. Domains were stripped of nearly every able-bodied man. Towns and castles found themselves besieged regularly, and women, whether they wanted to or not, were thrust repeatedly into combat situations. Chancellor T. in Kinkata, writing in the 14th century in his journal Entairayaku, noted the existence of predominantly female cavalry units, originating particularly from Western Japan. He seems surprised by this, which suggests it wasn't universal, but he also treated it as a known phenomenon rather than a shocking anomaly. By the Sengoku period, such units appear to have become more common. One particularly fascinating account comes from a chronicle called the Bichi Hyoranki. It describes the wife of Mimura Kotoku, whose castle was under siege. When the situation became dire and women and children began committing mass suicide to avoid capture, she was appalled. Instead of accepting defeat, she armed herself with a naginata, gathered 83 soldiers, and led a counterattack against the besiegers. The chronicle describes her whirling her naginata like a water wheel, cutting down enemies until she fell in battle. Or consider Myrin, a warrior nun who inspired defenders to resist 3,000 Shimazu soldiers attacking her temple. Or Kaihime, who fought against the Toyotomi clan during the siege of Oshi Castle in 1590. Or Onamihime, who became the representative leader of the Nikkaid clan and fought various battles against her own nephew, the famous daimyo Date Masamune. And then there's Archaeological Teruko, who earned the extraordinary title of the strongest woman in the Warring States period. Teruko reportedly fought actively in battles until she was 76 years old. 76. That's not defending your home from bandits once or twice. That's a lifetime of warfare, spanning decades of conflict. The woman was still swinging a blade, while most people her age in modern times are worrying about their retirement accounts. But perhaps the most remarkable story from this period involves a woman named Ichikawa no Tsubone. In 1569, a retainer of the Mori family had to leave his post to join a military campaign. His wife, Ichikawa, took it upon herself to assume responsibility for defending Kate-Nomini Castle in his absence. She organized her ladies-in-waiting, armed them, and prepared for the inevitable attack. When enemy forces arrived and began their siege, Ichikawa directed the defense personally, with her armed female household fighting alongside the remaining guards. These stories share a common thread. Women fighting not because they chose warfare as a career, but because warfare came to them and they refused to be passive victims. The Onna-bugeisha of the Sengoku period had to be ready constantly. They trained regularly, maintained their weapons, and understood that the next siege could happen tomorrow. There's also Ochi-ho-ri Tsu-ru-hi-mei, sometimes called the Joan of Arc of Japan. She was a Shinto shrine maiden who became a military commander, leading naval forces in defense of Mishima Island. Her story blends religious devotion with martial prowess. She fought in the name of the gods she served, wearing the robes of a miko while wielding a naginata in battle. Her legend became so powerful that she's still celebrated in local festivals on Mishima today. And we can't discuss the Sengoku period without mentioning Yododono, also known as Cha-Cha. She was the daughter of Oichi and the niece of Oda Nobunaga, one of the great unifiers of Japan. After becoming the wife and later widow of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, another great unifier, she found herself as the de facto head of Osaka Castle, protecting her son Hideyori's claim to power. When Tokugawa Ieyasu, the third great unifier, moved against them in 1615, Yododono directed the defense of Osaka Castle during both the winter and summer sieges. She was a political strategist more than a frontline warrior, but her role was crucial. When the castle finally fell, she and her son committed suicide in the flames rather than be captured. Some historians view this as the last significant act of the Onna-bugeisha tradition in its militant form, a final defiant gesture before everything changed. because, by the time the siege of Osaka ended, Japan's long period of warfare was effectively over. Tokugawa Ieyasu had won. The country would be unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, ushering in the Edo period, an era of peace that would last more than 250 years. Peace is generally a good thing, but for the Onna-bugeisha, peace would prove nearly as destructive as any war. Daily life. The balance between sword and home. Before we talk about the decline of the Onna-bugeisha, we should understand what their daily lives actually looked like. Because these weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were women of the samurai class. And that meant navigating a complex set of duties and expectations that went far beyond simply knowing how to fight. A typical Onna-bugeisha might wake before dawn. The household wouldn't run itself, and despite her martial training, she was still expected to manage domestic affairs. In many samurai households, the wife was effectively the chief operating officer. She managed finances, supervised servants, organized social events, maintained family relationships, and ensured the household ran smoothly so her husband could focus on his duties to their lord. But she also had to maintain her martial skills. This meant regular practice. She might spend the early morning hours before the household stirred going through naginata kata, those repeated forms that kept her techniques sharp. Or she might practice archery, shooting at targets in the compound. These weren't optional activities or hobbies. In a world where your home might be attacked at any time, being able to defend it was as essential as being able to manage the household budget. Education was another responsibility. If she had daughters, she needed to teach them the skills they'd need, both martial and domestic. Young girls of samurai families learned alongside their brothers until around age 6 or 7. They learned to read and write, studied poetry and literature, learned proper etiquette and ceremony. But they also learned the basics of self-defense, how to fall, how to hold a weapon, how to move. As they got older, their training would diverge. Boys focused increasingly on martial arts and military training. Girls continued their martial education, but also learned the specific skills needed to manage a household, accounting, textile work, organization, negotiation. They learned about the kaiken, the small dagger every samurai woman was expected to carry. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool of last resort. Traditionally used to commit ritual suicide if capture seemed imminent, preserving honor through death. Marriage was a strategic affair in samurai families. Alliances between clans were often cemented through marriage, and women were expected to serve as bridges between families. When a woman married into another samurai household, she often brought her naginata as part of her dowry, a symbol of her training and capability. She was expected to be loyal to her new family, even if it meant potentially fighting against her birth family should the clans come into conflict. But loyalty ran both ways. A samurai woman who married into a family became responsible for its welfare. If her husband was called to war and didn't return, she might find herself managing the entire estate, making military and political decisions, negotiating with other clans. Widows of samurai often wielded considerable power, and their martial training wasn't decorative. It was a practical necessity for protecting their inherited position and their children's futures. Social gatherings were another crucial element. When a daimyo visited, the lady of the household was responsible for organizing an appropriate reception. This wasn't just about hospitality. These events were political theater, opportunities to demonstrate the family's wealth, culture, and capability. A wife who managed these events well enhanced her family's standing. One who bungled them could damage important alliances. The warrior wife also served as an intelligence gatherer. In a feudal society built on personal relationships and family connections, women formed their own networks of information exchange. They knew which families were allied, which were feuding, which were rising in status or falling. This information was valuable, and a politically astute Onna-bugeisha could use it to benefit her family. There's a quote from the famous daimyo Mori Motonari worth noting here. He stated that maintaining sound family relationships was fundamentally a woman's responsibility. The warrior wife was expected to ensure that sons who weren't heirs were adopted into good families, maintaining connections. She had to make sure her children continued to have good relations with each other after such adoptions. She was, in effect, the social glue holding together a network of familial alliances that could prove crucial in times of conflict. And always, there was the understanding that violence could arrive without warning. A raid by a rival clan, bandits taking advantage of the lord's absence, rebels attacking during a succession dispute. When that happened, everything else stopped mattering. The household accounts, the social obligations, the poetry lessons. All of that became irrelevant the moment enemy forces appeared at the gates. Then, the Onna-bugeisha became exactly what she'd trained to be. A warrior defending her home with everything she had. The naginata came down from its place of honor. Armor was donned, and she took her position, ready to kill or die, to protect everyone and everything behind her. This was the reality of their lives. Not constant warfare, but constant readiness for warfare. Not rejecting domestic duties, but balancing them with martial responsibility. They were warriors who managed households, or perhaps household managers who happened to be warriors. The distinction probably didn't mean much to them. Both roles were essential. Both required discipline, skill, and dedication. And failing at either could mean disaster for everyone who depended on them. The Edo period, when peace became a weapon. In 1603, after decades of warfare, Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate, ushering in what would become known as the Edo period. For the first time in more than a century, Japan was unified and stable. The constant warfare that had defined the Sengoku period was over. This was, objectively speaking, a good thing. Peace allowed the economy to recover, culture to flourish, and people to live without constant fear of violence. But for the Onna-bugeisha, and indeed for the entire samurai class, peace was complicated. The Tokugawa implemented a series of policies designed to prevent future civil wars. One of the most significant was essentially disarming the countryside. Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi had already begun this process with their katanagari, sword hunts, scouring the provinces for weapons to prevent peasant uprisings. The Tokugawa continued and expanded these policies. Weapons became tightly controlled. Carrying a sword became a privilege of the samurai class specifically. But here's the thing, if there's no war, what do warriors do? The samurai class didn't disappear, but their role transformed dramatically. Instead of fighters, they became bureaucrats, administrators, police agents. They still carried swords as symbols of their status, but those swords rarely left their scabbards except for practice. The martial culture remained, but it became increasingly ceremonial, focused on forms and tradition rather than practical combat. For male samurai, this transition was jarring but manageable. They had social status, political power, administrative positions. They went from warriors to officials, but they remained important and respected. For Onna-bugeisha, the changes were more devastating. The Edo period brought with it a rigid new social philosophy. Neo-Confucianism, imported from China and adapted to Japanese circumstances. And Neo-Confucianism had very clear ideas about proper roles for men and women. According to Neo-Confucian thought, society worked best when everyone occupied their proper place in a strict hierarchy. Men were superior to women, fathers to children, lords to vassals. Women's proper place, according to this philosophy, was in the home, focused entirely on domestic duties and obedience to male relatives. A woman should obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her sons in widowhood. The I system emerged from this philosophy. I, meaning house, established the household as the fundamental unit of society. With the male head holding all authority, only men could inherit property or keep the family name. Women became, legally and socially, dependents. They could not participate in matters outside the home. They could not travel without male companions and specific permits. They had essentially no legal recourse if mistreated. Marriage and divorce laws illustrate this starkly. A husband could divorce his wife by simply sending her a letter stating his wish to end the marriage. These letters became known as mikudarihan, 3.5 lines, because that's literally how brief they could be. Meanwhile, a woman who wanted to leave her husband, even if he was abusive or cruel, had no legal options. She either endured or sought refuge in certain temples that offered sanctuary, hoping the temple would negotiate her release. In this new social order, the idea of women warriors became not just irrelevant, but actively problematic. How could you maintain the fiction of male superiority and female passivity when everyone's grandmother might have killed a dozen enemy soldiers in her youth? The Onna-bugeisha represented a contradiction, living proof that women could be just as capable as men in one of the most masculine-coded activities possible, warfare. So they began to be written out, not suddenly, not through any single policy or decree, but gradually, through 1,000 small erasures. Historical chronicles emphasized male warriors exclusively. When women had to be mentioned, their martial accomplishments were minimized or reframed as unusual exceptions rather than part of a broader tradition. Epic poems and ballads focused on male heroes. Art depicted battles as exclusively male affairs. The naginata itself underwent a transformation. It remained part of samurai women's education, but its purpose changed. Training with the naginata was reframed as a method of instilling proper feminine virtues, discipline, endurance, self-sacrifice. Martial arts scholar Ellis Amdur notes that naginata practice became about merging with a spirit of self-sacrifice and connecting with the hallowed ideals of the warrior class. In other words, It became about learning to be a good wife, not about learning to kill attackers. Women were encouraged, or more accurately required, to focus on childbearing and homemaking. The publication of texts like the Onna-bugeisha, Greater Learning for Women, codified these expectations. This deeply misogynistic text identified women's 5 defects: anger, jealousy, disobedience, ignorance, and a tendency toward illness. It instructed women in proper comportment, emphasizing obedience, submission, and the importance of not bothering men with their trivial concerns. Travel became difficult for women of all classes, but especially for samurai women. They needed permits to travel and had to be accompanied by men. The freedom of movement that had been necessary for their roles as warriors and estate managers was systematically eliminated. Ellis Amdur notes that husbands and wives didn't even customarily sleep together during this period. The husband would visit his wife to initiate any sexual activity and afterwards would retire to his own room. The relationship between husband and wife was correlated to that of a lord and his vassal. And yet, resistance continued. Some women maintained their training in secret or semi-openly. Naginata schools led by women survived, quietly passing down techniques and traditions. A few families, particularly in certain regions, maintained the older traditions more openly, arguing that preparedness was never truly obsolete. Women like Sasaki Rui and Nakazawa Koto became prominent swordswomen during the Edo period, though their stories were less widely told. In isolated instances, the old ways proved their worth. During local disturbances or when bandits appeared, there were still cases of Onna-bugeisha defending their homes. But these incidents became increasingly rare and increasingly less likely to be recorded or acknowledged. By the mid-Edo period, the transformation was largely complete. Women of the samurai class were expected to be models of quiet, passive obedience. The roaring ideals of fearless devotion and martial capability had been replaced by rigid social convention. The Onna-bugeisha, as an active tradition, had been successfully suppressed, but not entirely eliminated, because in 1868, something unexpected happened. Japan exploded into civil war again. The old order collapsed, and for one brief, bloody moment, the Onna-bugeisha returned. The Battle of Aizu. The last stand. The year 1868 was transformative for Japan. The Meiji Restoration began, ostensibly returning power to the emperor after centuries of shogunate rule, but really representing a coup by reformist factions who wanted to modernize Japan rapidly. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled for more than 250 years, was overthrown. The samurai class would soon be abolished entirely. Japan was about to transform from a feudal society into a modern nation-state, but not everyone supported these changes. The Boshin War erupted, pitting forces loyal to the emperor against those supporting the shogunate. The Aizu domain, in what's now Fukushima Prefecture, sided with the Tokugawa. This turned out to be a catastrophic choice. The domain's samurai, renowned for their discipline and martial skill, found themselves branded as enemies of the emperor. Imperial forces, numbering roughly 20,000 and equipped with modern firearms, marched north to crush them. By autumn 1868, the Aizu defenders had been driven back to Aizu Wakamatsu, their principal castle town. The siege of Tsuruga Castle began, and it was brutal. For a month, the castle was bombarded day and night, cannonballs pounded the walls constantly. The defenders, outnumbered 5-1, knew they were doomed. This wasn't a battle they could win. It was a question of how long they could hold out and whether they could die with honor. The women of Aizu faced terrible choices. Many chose suicide rather than risk capture, knowing the stories of what happened to women after castles fell. The wife of Kawahara, after killing her own mother-in-law and daughter to spare them a worse fate, donned her white kimono, now stained red with their blood, cropped her hair, and walked onto the battlefield with a naginata, ready to die. But one young woman had a different idea. Her name was Nakano Takeko, and historical records indicate she was around 21 years old, though sources vary slightly on her exact age. Takeko had been born in Edo, modern Tokyo, the daughter of a high-ranking Aizu official. From age 6, she'd been trained in martial arts, specifically the naginata and the katana. By the time she was 20, she'd developed a fearsome reputation for her skill. When her family relocated to Aizu in early 1868, just months before the war arrived, she began teaching naginata to women and children in the castle. When the siege began, Takeko wanted to fight, not from the castle walls, not in a supporting role, but on the front lines. She approached the Aizu commanders and requested permission to form a combat unit of women. They refused. This was 1868, even in desperate circumstances, even when the old traditions of Onna-bugeisha were still in living memory. The idea of officially sanctioning women warriors was too much, so Takeko did it anyway. She gathered a group of about 20 to 30 women, including her mother, Nakano Takeko, her 16-year-old sister, recorded in different sources as either Waiko or Ma-sako, and other women willing to fight. They armed themselves with naginata. They wore hakama, the traditional split-skirt pants, and tied white headbands around their foreheads. They called themselves, or would later be called, the Joshi-tai, the Girls' Army, though they fought without official sanction or recognition. On October 16, 1868, at Yanaji Bridge in the Nishibata area of Fukushima, Takeko led her warriors in a charge against imperial troops from the Ohgaki domain. The imperial forces were armed with modern rifles, a devastating advantage. But when they realized they were fighting women, their commanders gave orders not to shoot them. That hesitation gave the Joshi-tai an opportunity. They attacked, and Takeko's naginata skills proved just as deadly as her reputation suggested. She personally killed at least 5 or 6 enemy soldiers before the shock wore off and the imperial troops resumed firing. A bullet struck Takeko. Most accounts say she was hit in the chest, though some records suggest it may have been her head. Either way, she was mortally wounded, and she understood what would happen to her body if the enemy took it. They would keep her head as a trophy, proof they'd killed a female rebel. She couldn't allow that dishonor. With what strength remained, she asked her sister to decapitate her. Her sister tried, but couldn't complete the grim task alone, whether from exhaustion, shock, or the difficulty of the act itself. An Aizu soldier, no Yoshisa Buro, helped finish what Takeko had requested. They carried Takeko's head away from the battlefield and later buried it at the base of a pine tree at Haki Temple in Aizu Bange. Her naginata was donated to the temple as well, and is still displayed there today. A monument was eventually erected beside her grave, and every year during the Aizu Autumn Festival, young girls wearing hakama and white headbands participate in a procession commemorating Nakano Takeko and her warriors. The Joshi Tai fought on after Takeko's death. Other members, including Hirata Kocho, who took command, and Yamamoto Yaeko, who became her deputy, continued the defense. Yaeko is particularly interesting. She was skilled with firearms, not the naginata, and fought using a rifle throughout the siege. After the war, she would become one of the first advocates for women's rights in the New Japan, a civil rights leader whose legacy extended far beyond her wartime service. Matsudira Tehru and Yamakawa Futaba also served in defending the castle, both becoming symbols of the struggle for Japanese women's rights in later years. The castle held out for several more weeks after Takeko's death, finally surrendering on November 6, 1868. The fall of Aizu effectively marked the end of the Boshin War and the beginning of Japan's modern era. The samurai class was abolished shortly afterward. The age of the warrior was over. Nakano Takeko is widely considered the last great Onna-bugeisha. Her death at the Battle of Aizu is seen as the final stand of a tradition that stretched back, possibly 1,000 years or more. She fought in a way that was recognizably part of that tradition, with a naginata, leading women in defense of her domain, refusing to accept a passive role even when commanders told her to stand down. But she also represents the end of an era. The enemies she fought weren't other samurai with swords and honor codes. They were modern soldiers with rifles and artillery, representing a new kind of warfare where individual martial skill mattered less than industrial production and organizational efficiency. The old ways couldn't compete with that. Even Takeko's exceptional skill couldn't overcome a modern military with modern weapons. After the Meiji Restoration, the systematic erasure of Onna-bugeisha from popular memory accelerated. The new government wanted to project a particular image of Japan to the world: civilized, modern, respectable. That image had no room for women warriors. Western ideas about proper feminine behavior were imported and embraced. Women were pushed ever more firmly into domestic roles. The few remaining martial arts schools that trained women were reframed yet again, this time as cultural preservation and physical education rather than practical combat training. The naginata became something young ladies learned for discipline and deportment, much like flower arranging or tea ceremony. And the stories, the incredible true stories of women like Tomoe Gozen and Hangaku Gozen and Nakano Takeko, were quietly set aside. If they were mentioned at all, they were treated as curious historical anomalies, exceptions that proved the rule of female domesticity rather than evidence of a long martial tradition. It would be more than a century before people started seriously reconsidering that narrative, before archaeologists started digging up battle sites and discovering the evidence of female combatants, before historians started asking difficult questions about why an entire tradition had been so thoroughly erased, before the Onna-bugeisha began to be recognized again for what they truly were: warriors whose skill, courage, and sacrifice deserved to be remembered. Arms, armor, and the warrior's kit, Let's get into the practical details of what an Onna-bugeisha actually carried and wore, because the image of a warrior isn't complete without understanding their equipment, the tools that made their role possible. The naginata, as we've discussed, was the primary weapon, but it came in varieties. The standard naginata, sometimes called naginata or great naginata, had a blade of about 2 feet and a shaft of 6 to 8 feet. But there was also the ko-naginata, the small naginata, with a shorter blade and shaft, lighter and more maneuverable in confined spaces. Many Onna-bugeisha preferred the ko-naginata for defending castles and homes, where tight corridors and rooms made the full-sized weapon unwieldy. Then there was the kaiken, that small dagger we mentioned earlier. Every samurai woman carried one, usually tucked into her obi, the sash around her waist. The kaiken was typically between 8 and 10 inches long, double-edged, and extremely sharp. Its primary purpose was grim, ritual suicide if capture seemed inevitable. But it could also serve as a last-ditch weapon in close-quarters combat. The art of fighting with the kaiken was called tanto-jutsu, and women trained in it from an early age. The techniques emphasize speed and precision, quick strikes to vulnerable points, defensive movements in confined spaces, how to turn an opponent's strength against them. It was brutal, intimate combat, the kind you only use when everything else has failed. For ranged combat, many Onna-bugeisha trained extensively with the yumi, the Japanese longbow. The yumi is an unusual weapon, asymmetric with the grip placed about 1/3 up from the bottom rather than in the middle. This design allowed it to be used from horseback or from a kneeling position. The bow was typically over 6 feet tall, made from bamboo and various woods laminated together. Drawing a yumi requires considerable strength, but it's more about technique than raw power. You don't just pull the string back. You push the bow away with your left hand while pulling the string towards you with your right. Done correctly, this allows for consistent, powerful shots. An experienced archer could hit targets at impressive distances, and from a castle tower or defensive position, archers could rain down death on attackers below. Now let's talk about armor. The iconic samurai armor, called yoroi, was elaborate and expensive, made of small lacquered metal or leather plates laced together with silk or leather cord. It was designed to deflect sword cuts and arrows while allowing reasonable mobility. Full sets included a helmet with a face mask, shoulder guards, chest and back plates, arm protection, thigh guards, and shin guards. Women's armor was generally similar to men's, but there were differences. Some sets were slightly lighter or adjusted for different body proportions. The cuirass might be designed differently to accommodate breasts, though this wasn't universal. Face masks for women sometimes had more feminine features, but others were identical to men's versions, complete with fierce expressions meant to intimidate enemies. The haramaki, a type of chest armor that wrapped around the torso, was popular among Onna-bugeisha because it was lighter and easier to don quickly. If you were a household defender who might need to arm yourself in minutes when an attack began, you didn't want to spend precious time assembling a full suit of armor. The haramaki could be thrown on rapidly, providing protection to your vital organs without the complexity of a complete set. Color and decoration of armor varied with status and period. Some Onna-bugeisha wore armor with family crests prominently displayed. Others chose more subdued colors. There are accounts of women deliberately wearing armor, styled like men's, making it difficult for enemies to identify them as female fighters until they were already engaged in combat. Footwear was practical: waraji, straw sandals, or sometimes going barefoot if fighting indoors. Heavy boots would have been too cumbersome and too noisy. Quick footwork was essential when wielding a naginata, and you needed to feel the ground beneath you. Hair was almost always tied back. Long hair in combat is a liability. It can be grabbed, can obscure vision, can get tangled in your weapons or armor. Most Onna-bugeisha tied their hair in a simple top knot or braid that kept it secure and out of the way. Some cut their hair short when battle was imminent, as Nakano Takeko did before the Battle of Aizu. Maintenance of all this equipment was constant work. Blades had to be cleaned, sharpened, oiled. Armor had to be inspected for damage, lacquer touched up, lacing replaced if it wore through. The bow required regular attention to keep the laminated wood from separating. Arrows had to be checked and repaired or replaced. An Onna-bugeisha was expected to maintain her own equipment. This wasn't delegated to servants. Your weapons were personal, intimate tools. You needed to know every inch of them, understand exactly how they would respond in your hands. The ritual of caring for your naginata wasn't just practical maintenance. It was a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the weapon that was, potentially, the only thing standing between your family and destruction. Legacy, rediscovery, and modern understanding. For roughly a century after the Meiji Restoration, the Onna-bugeisha were almost completely forgotten. The narrative of Japanese history, as presented both within Japan and internationally, had no room for them. Women were depicted as passive, domestic, submissive. Samurai culture was presented as exclusively male. The few mentions of female warriors were treated as curious anomalies, legendary figures of doubtful historicity. Then, in the late 20th century, things began to change. Archaeologists started systematically excavating medieval battle sites, and what they found didn't match the official narrative. At battle sites across Japan, researchers found evidence of female combatants. The excavations used osteological methods, examining bone structure to determine biological sex. While claims about DNA testing circulated widely, particularly after historian Stephen Turnbull's 2010 book, the original studies from the 1980s actually used morphological analysis of skeletal features rather than genetic testing. But the findings were still significant. Analysis of remains at several non-castle battle sites suggested that a notable percentage of the bodies showed female skeletal characteristics, challenging the notion that battlefields were exclusively male domains. Stephen Turnbull, who's written extensively on samurai culture, has called the exclusion of female warriors from traditional histories the greatest untold story in samurai history. Academic historians began re-examining primary sources. They looked at the chronicles that had always mentioned Tomoe Gozen and Hangaku Gozen, but had been dismissed as unreliable. They studied the Azuma Kagami, contemporary records from the Kamakura period that documented Hangaku's role in the Kennin rebellion. They found journal entries mentioning female cavalry units. They discovered that women appearing in armor with weapons wasn't a late embellishment to epic tales, but was present in the earliest accounts. The realization grew that the Onna-bugeisha hadn't been fictional or rare exceptions. They'd been common, integral to samurai military culture for centuries, and then deliberately written out of history during periods when their existence was ideologically inconvenient. This reassessment has accelerated in recent decades. Japanese popular culture has begun to embrace the Onna-bugeisha as symbols of female empowerment. Video games feature them as playable characters. Anime and manga depict them prominently. Historical dramas. The tiger dramas that are a staple of NHK television have started telling their stories again. In 2005, the tiger drama Yoshitsune featured Tomoe Gozen as a major character. In 2013, Yai no Sakura focused on Nijima Yai, the rifle-wielding defender of Aizu, who became a women's rights advocate after the war. It also depicted Nakano Takeko and other Onna-bugeisha of the Battle of Aizu. In 2017, Naotora, the Lady Warlord, was the first tiger drama where the female protagonist was the head of a samurai clan. Academic work has continued. Conferences on Japanese women's history now regularly feature sessions on the Onna-bugeisha. Books exploring their role have been published in multiple languages. Museums have created exhibits specifically about female warriors, displaying artifacts, armor, weapons, and historical documents that had long sat in storage, unexamined, because no one thought to look for evidence of women warriors. The Smithsonian Channel's documentary, Samurai Warrior Queens, aired in 2015, brought the story to international audiences. It examined the archaeological evidence, interviewed historians, and explored the cultural factors that led to the Onna-bugeisha tradition being suppressed and then forgotten. Naginata schools, both classical Koryu and modern competition styles, explicitly honor the legendary Onna-bugeisha in their training. Tomoe Gozen and Nakano Takeko are invoked as exemplars of the naginata practitioner's ideal. Some schools make pilgrimages to temples associated with famous female warriors, paying respects at their graves and memorials. The annual Aizu Autumn Festival remains a living connection to this history. Young girls dressed as Nakano Takeko and the Jeohashitai members march through the streets of Aizu Wakamatsu, carrying naginata, commemorating a battle that took place over a century and a half ago. It's a small gesture, perhaps, but it represents something important. A refusal to let these women be forgotten again. Modern Japanese feminists have embraced the Onna-bugeisha as powerful historical precedents for women's capability and agency. The fact that women once commanded troops, defended territories, and were respected as warriors provides a counter-narrative to more recent restrictions. It suggests that rigid gender roles aren't timeless tradition, but relatively recent social constructions. Internationally, the Onna-bugeisha have become part of broader discussions about women warriors across cultures. They're studied alongside the Amazons of Greek mythology, the women warriors of various African kingdoms, the shield maidens of Norse legend, and documented female fighters from various historical periods. Scholars examine what made certain societies willing to accept women as warriors, and what factors led to their suppression or erasure. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about how history is written and who gets to write it. The Onna-bugeisha weren't forgotten by accident. Their erasure was systematic, deliberate, part of a broader effort to reshape Japanese society according to Confucian ideals that had no room for martial women. When those ideals no longer served political purposes, when Japan needed to project a particular image to the world during its modernization, the erasure accelerated. This pattern repeats across cultures and time periods. Women who step outside prescribed gender roles often find their accomplishments minimized, their stories forgotten, their very existence questioned. The archaeological evidence of Onna-bugeisha matters not just because it proves these women existed, but because it reminds us to be skeptical of historical narratives that seem too neat, too convenient, too aligned with contemporary prejudices. The philosophy of the female warrior. We've talked a lot about what Onna-bugeisha did, but less about how they understood their role. While we have limited direct accounts from the women themselves, we can piece together something of their worldview from the broader samurai culture they inhabited and the specific roles they fulfilled. The samurai class lived according to bushido, the way of the warrior, though the term itself didn't come into common use until the Edo period. Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, discipline, and the willingness to die for your lord. It drew from multiple traditions: Zen Buddhism, Shinto beliefs, and Confucian ethics. For male samurai, the path was relatively straightforward. Your primary duty was to your lord. You trained constantly, served faithfully, and when called upon, you fought and, if necessary, died. Your honor depended on fulfilling these obligations. Failing to do so brought shame not just to yourself, but to your entire family line. For Onna-bugeisha, bushido appears to have taken a more complex form based on the roles we know they filled. They adhered to the same emphasis on loyalty, honor, and discipline. They trained just as rigorously, but their primary duty wasn't to ride off to war with their lord. It was to protect what the lord left behind: the home, the family, the estate, the future. This created what appears to have been a different kind of warrior ethos based on the roles we know they filled. Male samurai could, in some sense, seek glory on the battlefield. They could compete for recognition, advancement, reward. An Onna-bugeisha defending her home had no such opportunity. If she succeeded, it meant nothing had happened. The estate remained secure, the family safe. Everything continued as before. Her success was invisible, unremarked, expected. But if she failed, the consequences were catastrophic. The estate destroyed, the family dead or captured, the lineage ended. There was no middle ground, no partial victory. She either succeeded completely or lost everything. This likely shaped how Onna-bugeisha approached combat, at least in their defensive roles. They couldn't afford bravado or recklessness. They couldn't chase individual glory or take unnecessary risks. Every decision had to be calculated, every action purposeful. They fought defensively, strategically, using terrain and fortifications to maximum advantage. They retreated when necessary, regrouped, found better positions. The kaiken, that small dagger every samurai woman carried, symbolized this philosophy. It wasn't primarily a weapon for fighting. It was a tool for preserving honor through death. If the battle was truly lost, if capture seemed inevitable, The kaiken allowed a woman to die on her own terms rather than fall into enemy hands. The act, called jigai, was similar to the male samurai's ritual suicide, seppuku, but typically involved cutting the throat or stabbing the chest rather than disembowelment. This sounds grim to modern sensibilities, and it was, but in the context of medieval warfare, where captured women faced torture, sexual violence, and enslavement, the kaiken represented agency. It meant that even in the worst circumstances, a woman retained control over her fate and her honor. Training in the use of the kaiken began early. Young girls learned not just the physical technique, but the mental discipline required to use it if necessary. They learned to face death with composure, to value honor above life, to understand that some fates were worse than death. This wasn't about being passive or giving up. It was about maintaining dignity and protecting family honor in circumstances where all other options had been exhausted. But the philosophy of the Onna-bugeisha wasn't entirely focused on death and duty. There was also, based on what we know of samurai culture more broadly, a deep appreciation for beauty, culture, and refinement. The ideal warrior woman was expected to be skilled in tea ceremony, flower arranging, poetry, and calligraphy alongside her martial training. This wasn't hypocritical or contradictory within the samurai worldview. Both sets of skills reflected the same underlying values: discipline, precision, mindfulness, respect for tradition. In Zen philosophy, which heavily influenced samurai culture, there's no fundamental distinction between preparing tea and preparing for battle. Both require you to be fully present, to execute each movement with total attention, to accept the outcome without attachment. A woman who could compose a perfect poem or arrange flowers with exquisite taste demonstrated the same mental discipline she'd need when facing an enemy army. This integration of martial and cultural skills made Onna-bugeisha distinctive. They weren't just fighters. They were exemplars of a complete ideal of samurai womanhood, capable of deadly violence when necessary, but also capable of creating and appreciating beauty, managing complex households, navigating intricate social dynamics, and raising the next generation to uphold these same values. The historical record suggests that Onna-bugeisha took pride in this dual nature. Though we have limited direct testimony from the women themselves, they didn't see martial training as making them less feminine or cultural accomplishments as making them less martial. Both were essential aspects of who they were, and both were necessary for fulfilling their role in samurai society. Women warriors beyond the battlefield, while Tomoe Gozen, Hangaku Gozen, and Nakano Takeko are the most famous Onna-bugeisha. There were countless other women whose names we'll never know, but whose contributions were just as vital. They defended villages during raids. They protected families when bandits struck. They held castle gates against overwhelming odds. And most of the time, nobody bothered to write down what they did. But sometimes, fragments of their stories survive. In local histories, in family records, in temple documents. These fragments give us glimpses of a much larger story. There's a record from the Sengoku period about a woman named Ii Nach Otohra, who became the head of the Eli clan after most of the male leadership was killed or captured. Historical accounts indicate she ruled the domain for nearly a decade, making military and political decisions, managing alliances, and ensuring the clan's survival during one of the most chaotic periods in Japanese history. When she finally stepped down, it was to allow a male heir she'd fostered to take over. But by that point, she'd preserved the clan through its darkest hour. Or consider the women of the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637 and 1638. This was primarily a peasant uprising against oppressive taxation and religious persecution, but it drew support from various classes. While detailed records of individual participants are scarce, the siege that ended the rebellion was known for its desperation and the mass deaths that occurred when the fortress finally fell. Historical accounts suggest that in the final defense, people of all ages and genders fought, with many choosing death over surrender, understanding the brutal reprisals that awaited them. There are accounts of women serving as spies and scouts during the Sengoku period. Their ability to move through society in ways men couldn't made them valuable intelligence assets. A woman traveling to visit family raised fewer suspicions than a male warrior on the road. They could gather information at markets, temples, and social gatherings that would have been closed to men. Some women became administrators and strategists who never personally fought, but whose organizational skills and strategic thinking were essential to military campaigns. They managed supply lines, organized logistics, handled negotiations with other clans. This kind of work didn't involve swinging a naginata, but it was just as crucial to success in warfare. The historical record also hints at the possibility of women who disguised themselves as men to fight more openly. While documented cases are rare, the practice was known to exist in some form. Armor and clothing could potentially conceal gender identity, at least temporarily. Whether any significant number of supposed male warriors were actually women remains an open question that we may never be able to answer definitively. But the scattered references suggest it wasn't entirely unknown. And then, there were the women who trained intensively in martial arts, but never had to use those skills in actual combat. They spent years learning naginata techniques, archery, strategy, and never faced a real enemy. Their training wasn't wasted, though. They passed those skills to the next generation. They maintained the tradition. They embodied the ideal that preparedness was a virtue in itself, regardless of whether war ever came. These women, the ones who trained but never fought, might actually represent the majority of Onna-bugeisha throughout history. They're the hardest to document because nothing dramatic happened to them. They lived relatively ordinary lives as wives, mothers, estate managers. But they were ready, and that readiness, that capacity for violence held in reserve, shaped how they moved through the world. The question of numbers one. Question that frequently comes up is, how common were Onna-bugeisha really? The archaeological evidence from excavated battle sites has suggested varying levels of female participation, with some sites showing significant numbers, but how representative is that? Were female warriors common everywhere, or just in certain regions or circumstances? The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. The sample size from archaeological excavations is limited. Most medieval battle sites in Japan haven't been systematically excavated with modern techniques. The sites that have been studied might not be representative of warfare generally. What we can say is that female warriors appear repeatedly enough in historical records, art, and literature from the period to suggest they weren't vanishingly rare. When chronicles mention women fighting, they don't treat it as an impossible anomaly, but as something unusual, yet comprehensible within the cultural context. This pattern suggests female warriors were uncommon enough to be noteworthy, but familiar enough not to be shocking. Regional variations likely mattered. Western Japan, particularly areas associated with the Taira clan, seems to have had a stronger tradition of female cavalry units. Northern domains like Aizu maintained martial training for women more actively than some other regions. Families with strong military traditions tended to be more serious about training daughters as well as sons. The type of conflict probably affected female participation rates too. During major open field battles where professional armies clashed, female participation was likely lower. But during defensive sieges, local conflicts, or when domains were stripped of most male fighters, women became combatants out of necessity rather than choice. Social class was another crucial factor. We're primarily talking about women of the samurai class, the bushi. These were aristocratic warriors, a small percentage of the overall population. Peasant women also sometimes fought, particularly during rebellions or when their villages were threatened. But they lacked the formal training and cultural tradition of the samurai women. The economic reality was that martial training required resources, weapons, armor, teachers, time. A family had to be wealthy enough to afford these things and to believe that training daughters as well as sons was worthwhile. This wasn't universal even among the samurai class, but it was common enough to be considered normal. Looking at the broader context of medieval Japanese warfare helps make sense of what we do know. Wars often dragged on for years, decades even. Domains could be stripped of most able-bodied men for extended periods. Someone had to maintain defense of the home territory, and that someone was often the women. In this context, finding evidence of female combatants at battle sites, particularly during defensive actions or prolonged conflicts, becomes more understandable. It might even be expected given the circumstances. What's clear is that the historical narrative that depicted samurai culture as exclusively male was wrong. Women were integral to that culture, not peripheral to it. They trained in the same martial traditions, lived by the same warrior code, and when necessary, fought and died defending the same values and territories. The exact numbers might be debatable, but their significance isn't. Cultural impact and symbolism. Beyond their practical military role, Onna-bugeisha held important symbolic meaning in Japanese culture. They represented a particular ideal of feminine strength, not masculinity in women, but a specifically female form of power and capability. In art and literature from the medieval period, Onna-bugeisha appear frequently. Woodblock prints depict women in armor wielding naginata. Scrolls show them defending castles or riding into battle. These images weren't just historical documentation. They were part of how Japanese society understood and valued different forms of courage and loyalty. The naginata itself became a powerful symbol. When a bride brought her naginata as part of her dowry, it represented more than just a weapon. It symbolized her readiness to defend her new family, her training and discipline, her connection to samurai values. The naginata displayed in a household wasn't just decoration. It was a statement of identity, and readiness. In No theatre and other traditional performance arts, Onna-bugeisha characters appear regularly. These performances kept their stories alive even during periods when acknowledging female warriors was less socially acceptable. The stage allowed for a kind of cultural memory that persisted despite official narratives that minimized or erased women's martial roles. Folk tales and legends also preserved Onna-bugeisha traditions. Local stories about women who defended villages or defeated bandits circulated orally, passed down through generations. Many of these stories were never written down or have been lost, but they shaped regional identities and provided role models for young women. The symbolic importance of Onna-bugeisha extended to their role in Buddhist and Shinto contexts as well. Some women warriors became associated with particular temples or shrines after their deaths. O-hori tsuru hi me, the warrior shrine maiden, is still venerated in ceremonies on Oh-mi-shi-ma Island. The combination of religious devotion and martial prowess in her story resonates with deep cultural themes about duty, sacrifice, and the defense of sacred spaces. In more recent times, the rediscovery of Onna-bugeisha has taken on new symbolic meaning. For Japanese feminists and women's rights advocates, these historical figures provide powerful examples of women's capability and agency. They challenge narratives about traditional Japanese culture being inherently restrictive of women's roles. They demonstrate that gender roles are culturally constructed and changeable, not fixed or inevitable. Internationally, Onna-bugeisha have become part of broader conversations about representation and historical accuracy. Their inclusion in media, games, and popular culture challenges stereotypes about both Japanese history and about women warriors more generally. They're featured in video games like Total War, Shogun, and depicted in anime and manga alongside their male counterparts. This renewed interest has sometimes led to romanticization or oversimplification, as often happens when historical figures are rediscovered. Modern depictions of Onna-bugeisha can fall into the trap of making them seem more common or more powerful than historical evidence supports, or, conversely, of treating them as exceptional outliers rather than part of a sustained tradition. The reality, as usual, is more nuanced and more interesting than either extreme. The end of an era and modern parallels. When the Meiji government formally abolished the samurai class in 1876, it didn't just end a social category, it dismantled an entire way of life that had persisted for centuries. Samurai lost their legal privileges, their stipends, their exclusive right to carry swords. Many struggled to adapt to the new social order. For Onna-bugeisha, this transition was even more complicated. Not only was their class abolished, but the martial traditions that had given them purpose and identity were recast as obsolete remnants of a backwards past. The new Japan wanted to project modernity and civilization to the world, and that meant adopting Western attitudes about gender roles, which ironically were often more restrictive than what had existed in samurai culture. The Meiji period saw Japanese women's legal rights actually decline in some ways. The new Civil Code of 1898 enshrined male authority over households in law. Women lost what limited property rights they'd had under feudal arrangements. Education for women focused on preparing them to be good wives and wise mothers, not warriors or leaders. martial arts training for women continued, but it was thoroughly domesticated. Naginata practice became primarily about physical fitness and character development, not combat readiness. The philosophical and cultural aspects were emphasized over practical fighting applications. By the early 20th century, naginata had become something middle-class girls did in school, like gymnastics or dance, rather than serious martial training. This continued through World War II and into the post-war period. During the war, there was some revival of martial training for women as Japan mobilized for total war. But this was brief and didn't restore the Onna-bugeisha tradition in any meaningful sense. After Japan's defeat, the American occupation authorities were suspicious of all martial arts as potentially militaristic, further marginalizing these traditions. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that serious historical interest in Onna-bugeisha began to revive. This coincided with the rise of second-wave feminism internationally and the beginning of Japan's own women's rights movements. Scholars started asking why historical accounts had so thoroughly erased or minimized women warriors. Archaeologists began paying attention to the sex of remains found at battle sites. A different picture of Japanese history slowly emerged. Today, we can look at the Onna-bugeisha tradition and see parallels with modern debates about women in military service, in combat roles, in positions of authority and power. The same arguments that were once used to justify excluding women from samurai martial culture are echoed in contemporary discussions. Women aren't strong enough. Their presence disrupts unit cohesion. It goes against tradition. It's contrary to feminine nature. The Onna-bugeisha provide a historical counter-argument to all of these claims. For centuries, Japanese culture found ways to integrate women into warrior roles while maintaining social order and military effectiveness. The system wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't equal in the modern sense. But it worked. Women defended territories, commanded troops, and fought effectively alongside men. What changed wasn't biology or some fundamental truth about gender and warfare. What changed were political and social structures, ideas about proper roles, cultural values. The Onna-bugeisha were written out of history not because they never existed or weren't effective warriors, but because acknowledging their existence became inconvenient to new narratives about how society should be organized. This historical lesson has broader implications. It suggests that many of our assumptions about what women can or can't do, should or shouldn't do, are based more on cultural convention than on actual capacity. The Onna-bugeisha didn't succeed because they were exceptional outliers, or because medieval Japan was more enlightened about gender than other societies. They succeeded because they were trained, prepared, and given roles where their capabilities were valued and utilized. Remembering the forgotten warriors. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the world of the Onna-bugeisha. We've traveled from the mythical Empress Jingu through centuries of warfare and social change, from legendary warriors like Tomoe Gozen to the last stand of Nakano Takeko at Aizu. We've seen how these women trained, fought, lived, and died. We've explored how their stories were nearly lost and are now being rediscovered. What should we take away from all of this? First, that history is never as simple or straightforward as it's often presented. The narrative of Japanese samurai culture as exclusively male was always incomplete, but it persisted because it served certain political and social purposes. When we look deeper, when we examine archaeological evidence and primary sources more carefully, a richer and more complex picture emerges. Second, that women's contributions to history are often systematically minimized or erased, not because those contributions weren't significant, but because acknowledging them challenges established power structures. The Onna-bugeisha were forgotten on purpose, written out of a history that needed them not to exist. Their rediscovery is part of a broader process of recovering women's historical agency across cultures and time periods. Third, that martial prowess and cultural refinement aren't opposites. The Onna-bugeisha embodied both. They could kill with ruthless efficiency and compose beautiful poetry. They managed complex households and defended castles. They raised children and led troops. This integration of different skills and values offers a different model of what strength and capability can look like. Fourth, that traditions and gender roles are always changing, always being renegotiated. The idea that women can't be warriors is just that, an idea, and one that varies dramatically across time and culture. Medieval Japan found ways to integrate women into martial culture. That doesn't mean we should romanticize feudal Japanese society, which had many brutal and oppressive aspects. But it does mean we should be skeptical when people claim that certain roles are naturally or inevitably restricted by gender. The Onna-bugeisha fought for many things, for their families, their lords, their domains, their honor. They fought because they were trained to, because circumstances demanded it, because they believed in the values of their culture, even when those values were being turned against them. They weren't fighting for women's rights or equality in the modern sense. They were fighting for survival and honor within the framework of their time and place. But their legacy transcends their original context. Today, they inspire people who are fighting different battles, for recognition, for opportunity, for the right to be taken seriously, regardless of gender. They provide historical evidence that women's exclusion from certain roles isn't based on incapacity, but on social convention. They remind us that history is richer and more complex than we often acknowledge. Every year, at the Aizu Autumn Festival, young girls march through the streets wearing white headbands and carrying naginata, commemorating Nakano Takeko and her warriors. It's a small ritual, perhaps, but it represents something important. A refusal to forget, a commitment to honoring courage and sacrifice regardless of gender, a connection to a tradition that was nearly lost. The Onna-bugeisha are no longer forgotten. Their stories are being told again, studied, shared. Archaeological and historical evidence increasingly confirms what literary sources suggested. They were real. They participated in warfare in meaningful numbers, and they were trained and capable fighters. They defended their homes and families with everything they had. They lived and died according to the warrior code, bushido, with dedication and honor that matched their male counterparts. They were the female samurai warriors of feudal Japan, and they deserve to be remembered. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the Onna-bugeisha, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me continue creating these explorations of forgotten history. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next. There are so many incredible stories still waiting to be told. Until next time, sleep well.